My name is Neil Forrest. I teach at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, OCAD University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I'm a ceramist, perhaps a generalist within the field of ceramics. And today I'm going to present a single piece, an installation, and I would say that it's very much inflected in by the idea that architecture is a host for many ideas. My field tends to produce singular objects, often functional, but I like asking certain questions about the material itself. So this project, which was funded by the Norwegian Artistic Research Council, was generous enough to allow me to ask a very broad question, and it was a question about porosity, because that tends to be the enemy for those of us who are producing works in ceramics, especially those things that are functional. So I saw that, well, let's bring the enemy over onto our side and see about what this question might bring. I still needed to find a form. It needed to have a way of becoming organized, some kind of organizing principle, to which I turned to my friends like Philip and Brian to help me think through questions about what architecture might do to help structure, in fact, even a materials-based question as simple as what is porosity. And the Norwegians would say Porøs, and it's a simple word but with a lot of ramifications. I'm going to start with a few images of things that really inspired what I eventually came up with an installation. I'll go through them quickly. This church, this wood church, Stavkirke in the north part of Norway, all wood. Many of you would know Paul Virilio, and what would interest me are not perhaps the political ramifications, but this idea of the bunker as an ark. He doesn't explain it, but I think he leaves us with an open question that could produce some interesting existential questions. I visited Waterloo posts, cisterns. One might think of the great cistern in Istanbul as well as this one in Morocco. But my real kind of rock, as it were, on this project is Bernard Palissy, who produced an idea for Catherine de' Medici that was never realized, but he was the kind of madman Renaissance ceramic artist, a potter, who had much to do with the early ideas in the modern theory of hydrology, of fossil science. And for that to be found by someone who just examined the earth with his own eyes, empirical study, that provided a great basis and a great kind of moral support for me as I moved into this unknown territory myself. So a first kind of concept drawing of what it is that I would make. I started to narrow things down. I would deal with one ceramic typology, and that would be cisterns. That we might think of as pots, that which would gather and hold. So the idea of settling tanks and ponds, and I started to assemble an idea that there might be a small industry or factory that I could produce. And that factory would be full of phenomena, and those phenomena might have some byproducts. They might infect the environment with humidity. They might help change the atmosphere in which we coexist. I also looked at traditional processes that, very craft-like processes. These two cisterns, as they were these settling tanks, where you see traditional salt making. And then I started my experiments, very basic, very fundamental. I started thinking, if architecture is a host, how could the fabric of ceramics be a host? And what would it host? I started thinking, ceramics is usually something that we apply glaze to, that we come and we put something on, we create an envelope for it. I thought, well, what if that envelope is derived from some other process that exists in nature, thinking about things that effloresce, things that seep, water and solubles that actually move through matter that we think is solid but is actually porous. And when things actually undergo state changes. So these are some of the crystals that I started growing. And please don't ask me the nature of these crystals. Some of them we don't want to touch. And what I created were objects, certainly the ones in these trays, which are a little over 1 meter long, objects that were kind of grown themselves. And I would actually spray them into existence. So there would be thousands of layers of sprayed clay that would go on them. And so they were kind of self-forming shapes around pieces of fabric and rope. Here, a series of kind of bells that, or trumpet shapes in which I grew crystals. And it turns out that growing crystals was much more difficult than I thought. I also thought for this installation that it would be a kind of collection of things, that it would be a number of things that I'm interested in. I can't really justify them other than that they're notional and they're interesting kind of material things. But in looking for ways to collect them, I thought, well, maybe I'll make a filing cabinet. And so what we see here is my filing cabinet. There are a series of milled porcelain grids, beautifully made by a student of mine who lives in Seoul, South Korea. And he milled these things out of beautiful porcelain. And then I would dip them in baths with, of soluble salts. I think this one is as simple as borax. And then I would leave them in, and I would let them start to grow their own decoration. This is a shot of the sort of the length of the exhibit, or the size of the exhibition. So it's a single object in which I started to, as I say, collect a number of things that I've long wanted to build and make. So these ceramic cisterns were really, they end up being, rather like ships in a bottle, but things also that I could pay homage to. So in homage to my then adopted country of Norway, which I spent part of 5 years there, I built a Stav church, a very beautiful one of the ones that's survived the sort of recent spate of tragic arsons in Norway. And a Sverre Fehn building that you see on the far side, who's a precursor, I think, to many other wonderful works of architecture. And so these, I decided that I would honor them by actually sinking them within a vessel, so they become these little baubles within the exhibition, the only things that are kind of clearly representational. Well, except for a few more things that are representational, including these kind of scientific bottles. So this is a kind of ode to Josiah Wedgwood, who created a lot of kind of scientific materials and scientific vessels. So those crucibles, so you can start to see here that the kind of overarching theme would be a set of crucibles that would hold various things, some that were active, some that were mechanically assisted. Other things that were kind of sprayed into existence is these topographies that had a small irritant on them that then I would kind of spray thousands of layers and they would produce their own form. And here's the kind of mechanical heart of the project. It's this is my kind of mixing board, and what I'm mixing for is to create a kind of stone-like material, in this case a kind of a slightly porous ceramic, in which I could force water through it by a pump and a compressor. So you can start to hear it. So there's a real strong kind of audible experience when you're near these pieces. So these are my atomizing tablets, and they're all in a loop where the water is pushed through them, it's gathered up, sent back, and in a reciprocal manner is brought back to its point of origin. Other kinds of porous rods that are also in a cistern. And there's the system itself, consisting of rather simple mechanical things, and many of which can go wrong. And here is the datum on which everything is hosted. So that becomes this kind of ramp by which people can kind of use as a sidewalk to pick through it. And this would be just a concluding image here. So thank you very much. If there's any questions, maybe there's a moment to answer anything. Philip.
Neil, these are extraordinarily refined, visionary ceramics, and the images that you've presented imply a gallery setting. But I know that you have also worked at large scale in landscape as well, and I wonder if you could just comment on the different scales that you've worked at.
In many ways, Philip, and thank you for noting some of these things. I've often thought, and maybe you've thought the very same thing, that there's a way to kind of prototype by doing things that that might work, that might produce some sort of larger result. And thinking about architecture, and as it historically has been, that it hosts other things. It not only hosts people, but a set of kind of materials and processes and environments in it. And so I think of these things as something that would be scalable in a sense. I mean, these ones that are up on the screen look very much like tiles, but in some ways I envision this, because this is a very kind of tactile thing, as an entire plaza in the summertime. You know, I often think of Nathan Phillips Plaza growing up when I was a kid and seeing it, knowing that it's heated, and that when you walk on it, you would have a different experience of walking on a heated surface, where this kind of, these millions of little tubules that are inside the clay produce a beautiful kind of tactile effect. So the idea here would be to produce a more kind of reliable substrate on which we could actually walk, because it is a dense material, it is a rock, so that these things could produce actually one of the more ignored surfaces in architecture, which is that which upon we walk, the geology, the firmitas. And so I'm thinking of these things as much as they are sculptures right now, but they could have a different, they could be situated differently.